a lot of the stuff that we're seeing going on right now, the data that they're pulling from is a lot of it's from the 1970s and 80s, right? They're reading authors and studies and famous thinkers from in these sort of activist movements who are writing from a perspective of a world that no longer exists, first of all, right? And like you said, they're projecting their own, or not even their own, they're projecting the perspective of someone they read who lived, who is writing from a perspective 60 years ago, right? Right? Like how long ago was the 1950s and 60s, right?
Right. Well, that's it, and they really, it's weird. I feel like they're living in some kind of time warp, where I read some of the stuff and I'm like, did you go into a coma at a certain point and then like wake up and you just forgot everything? Because the other thing that you and I talked about yesterday, we talked about being very aware, both as children and young adults, about the Soviet Union, its existence, its impact, the difference between it and its policies and the United States. And then I think most importantly, you pointed out coming into contact with people towards the end, at or after the fall of the Soviet Union, where, the first generation, the generation that kind of had like grown up with those policies and what they were most concerned of. Tell us more about that, because I think that is really interesting what you just said about projection. And it's like, they're in this different time. That's the one that really drives me crazy about people today. They're forgetting this whole thing.
Yeah. Well, part of it is, I think that when the Cold War ended, right, and arguably 89 to 90 in the early 90s, as the fall of the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and at the end of the day, the end of the Cold War. And there was this collective sigh of relief that, first of all, we weren't all going to be dying a horrible fiery death of nuclear annihilation, right? Like that was, I don't know if that was your childhood nightmare, but that was mine.
No, I mean, for sure. They were doing duck and cover drills in my elementary school.
So
like, I'm sure my little desk is going to save my life from nuclear.
Yes. So you're growing up thinking, so at any moment, at any time, we could all just get the entire surface of planet Earth could be roasted. What was it, like 100 times they had enough nukes for, or something like that?
Yeah.
So that ended, and everyone's like, oh, thank goodness. and communism is over, right? And that was, I think, this mistake, this idea, well, it failed, it's over, the threat is gone, and we can get on with life now. Right. And then we had 10 years of relative whatever, not a whole lot of no major enemy, and then boom, the war on terror, right? 9/11 happened. But so then, of course, it all became about Middle Eastern terrorism and all this other stuff, but we forgot about that, the ideology, those ideologies. And this, to the point you were talking about, in between my sojourns in the film, I was sneaking off campus to go work in film production when I was a student, and then ended up working overseas for the government. Family pressures, they wanted me to go into something a little more respectable than entertainment, especially back then. So I kind of humored them a little bit, and I did some overseas work for the government, and we talked about that a little bit yesterday. Working, and it was mainly in working in post-communist transition, helping in different ways with these sort of former Soviet and Eastern Bloc countries, who, these are entire generations, no one living alive who hadn't grown up under the one-party communist system. Right, so they had no idea how to do democracy or capitalism or free markets, and so there were so that was big component of the project that I first.
But you mentioned something about surveillance. You said that where they felt the worst.
Yeah,
like it was kind of like, it was not so much the freedom to do the commerce part, but it was just the freedom from looking over their shoulder every 2 seconds.
When I first got there, I mean, I went over obviously with my own ideas, and I had studied Russian Soviet foreign policy and the history of the rise of authoritarianism, fascism in Germany and communism in Russia and China, and had a lot of ideas about that. But I was surprised that when you're over there, you're meeting people, you're working with. I ended up teaching at university for a while there, and I taught a class. I was a master's students, international relations, and it was interesting to talk to them. And these were kids who they had grown up under communism, but now they were no longer living in there in that world, and they had a hard time, even forget coming up with a thesis, but actually picking their own essay topics, because their whole life they've been told what to write. And this is what's interesting is I finally called them. I said, guys, what's going on? Like you're dragging your heels on this. And they said, well, can't you just tell us what to write? And I said, what do you mean? They said, well, look, if we write or we say the wrong thing,
right,
then it could be held against us. Like it would stop us from getting into our PhD programs, or maybe like prevent us from getting that job we want. And if you just tell us what you want us to write, then if we get in trouble for it later, we can just blame you. And that was the surprise. Is I thought and a lot of people I talked to had that as their issue in different ways. The economic system, the communist economic system sucked. It was, lacked incentives. It had its issues, but it was the mass surveillance that really stuck with people. And I kind of had this fear that was really deep in them, that they were constantly being judged, that they were being surveilled, that they were going to be looked at, and then anything they ever did could be held against them at any time. And of course
they hated it, right? They hated it.
And it just stifled them, and it stagnated them. And I think I like to say that I know everybody likes to say America won the Cold War, right? But I don't think that's true. I think what happened was Russia lost the Cold War. Or not Russia, the Soviet Union lost the Cold War more than anything, because basically the whole system collapsed, right? It wasn't like the Cold War was a non-war. It was just a standoff with some proxies, and then one side just crumbled and the other side was left standing. Therefore, they won. And part of that stagnancy, that disintegration from within, is that the destruction of the human spirit, because people didn't care. Right. By the end of it, a lot of people just didn't care. And you could look around, and this was again in the 1990s when things were still fresh. And you could look at all the stuff that was built during the Soviet era. A lot of it was just garbage. It was crumbling. And you could tell that nobody cared for decades. And because they were all afraid, because if you actually cared, if you actually tried to achieve, you tried to do anything interesting or good or of any kind of quality, right, with any kind of merit, you were considered it was like you're sticking your neck out, you're sticking your head up, you're people everyone around you would resent you for then making them look bad.